Time now for the Sunday Talk, where we tap into the debate of the week. This week, whitewashing in film and television. Is it okay for Hollywood to take whatever they want from other cultures and make it their own? Death Note has the net abuzz. Another dark, oh-so-stylish series has the makings of a hit.
The human whose name is written in this note shall die.
But the latest Netflix original isn't original.
使い方、このノートに名前を。
You wouldn't be able to tell that Death Note is a wildly popular Japanese manga franchise. On Netflix, everything Japanese has been bleached a Wonder Bread white. Fans of the original call it cultural appropriation. The American film and TV industry calls it enormously profitable. There's the upcoming Scarlett Johansson vehicle, Ghost in the Shell, also a Japanese cultural phenomenon. In fact, pick a blockbuster from any year, and it's a good bet the idea came from another culture. But it goes both ways. Yes, Star Wars borrowed from famed director Akira Kurosawa, but he borrowed from Shakespeare and American Westerns. Japan's Ghost in the Shell owes a debt to America's 1980s cyberpunk classic, Blade Runner, and Bollywood appropriates the West greedily, sometimes remaking classics almost shot for shot. So what's the line between homage and cultural grand larceny? I'm joined by our panelists. Supriya Dwivedi is a radio talk show host in Toronto. Stephen Marsh is an author and culture writer for Esquire. And Elamine Abdelmahmoud is a social media editor for BuzzFeed Canada. So I'm going to start with you on this one, Stephen. What's your take? Insult or a sign of respect?
Just the natural order of culture. I mean, all culture for maybe 200 years, since the beginnings of globalization, since the beginning of really empire itself, has been involved in appropriation. And virtually all culture that anyone likes involves something taken or borrowed from another culture.
Do you agree, Elamine?
Not even a little bit.
Okay.
We knew that this was where this was going to go. Yeah, for sure. No, I don't think that you simply have an unlimited cultural license to take from other cultures and incorporate into your own. I think there's a responsibility the filmmakers have to the origin points of stories, and this ain't it.
I'll let you back in a moment, Stephen, but what's your sense of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I fall more on the Elamine spectrum on this. I think there, to a degree, there is a license to borrow certain things, but I think especially when you're talking about Hollywood and you're talking about representation and you're talking about whitewashing of characters, we saw Scarlett Johansson. Another good example of that would be Matt Damon in this Great Wall movie, where they very easily could have casted Asian American actors, and yet they didn't. And when you look at the representation of people that don't look white in Hollywood, it's often overlooked, and it's one of those things where it's like it's a very easy fix, and it's almost like they're asking for the backlash by doing this, simply knowing that in casting white actors for these roles, what they should be casting, visible minorities, and not doing it, and then they act surprised about it. It's just like I really don't understand.
Well, that movie was a Chinese co-production that had the greatest Chinese director of the past 30 years at its helm. The idea that, if it was whitewashing, it was done by Asian people.
That doesn't mean it's okay.
But it's for their profit. Well, I think because the question is one of power, right? I mean, there is a difference between, I think we confuse the situation of vulnerable minorities in a white-dominated culture where appropriation is very difficult with exchange with nations. I mean, you guys aren't watching Star Wars, I assume, right? Because, Jedi is a Japanese word. So that's appropriation.
So when I was 4 years old and growing up in Sudan,
yeah.
I watched Chuck Norris, and there's a
appropriation.
good, but there's a hold on a minute.
How dare you? How dare you take from another culture?
No, but that's different. He's watching the movie, but now you're saying they're not allowed to watch it.
Well, you're saying they shouldn't be able to watch Ghost in the Shell.
I'm not saying they shouldn't be allowed to watch it.
They didn't make Chuck Norris Sudanese.
That's right.
Well, they have done that in Kenya.
But here's the thing. My point, though, is that it's not the same thing. Right? Because American cultural sort of imperialism kind of spans the world over. Whereas
that's not true.
I think that's absolutely true.
Well, Bollywood is the great appropriator of culture. I've studied this. In the 19th century, they took Shakespeare, they turned Hamlet into 3.5 hour long musicals.
They literally did a Mrs. Doubtfire, which is like scene by scene copy of the movie. But the difference is Bollywood that takes place in India, there isn't a plethora of white Bollywood actors that you can just pick and choose and say, okay, well, let's do this. And that's also like saying, why isn't there a White History Month? Some things just aren't equivalent equivalent.
But it's not, because White History Month would make no sense in Canada or the United States or North America. But like in India, it makes perfect sense to take Mrs. Doubtfire and make the characters into Indian characters. I mean, that is the nature of appropriation. And the idea that,
Because
I mean,
it's for an
there's,
Indian audience
there's something
and there's
funny.
no white people.
There's something funny about Canadians sitting around worried about the cultural capital of India, Japan. Like,
I mean,
what was
I'm
our
Indian,
last
so
export?
I'm
What was our last export? Like Porky's? Like that was our last great cinematic export.
So is there no line then? What about they had Joseph Fiennes playing Michael Jackson? Is that acceptable?
Well, look, I think there's a big difference between taking, using non-Asian characters for Asian American characters in America. Like that is very different than simply taking stories from foreign cultures, like The Ring, for instance, which is a great Japanese folktale.
But hold on though. It's not just stories. It's also formats, right? Like manga is like an ancient Japanese format. This particular manga is really popular, and the only reason that this was adapted is because they want to capitalize on how successful that was. And so they're trying to tap into something that sort of became a global phenomenon as a Japanese product and trying to make it into a Netflix product that will also sell well. So I think
Ichiro plays baseball. Like the exchange has already happened. Like like Kurosawa took Shakespeare. He took the Western. He took what he wanted out of it and he left the rest.
You think that's equivalent?
They are equivalent. I mean, there's certainly the idea that the Japanese makers are in some position of powerlessness in comparison to America, is absurd. They are huge exporters of culture.
Supriya, you've mentioned the word representation as the thing that bothers you here.
Yeah.
Is part of the problem an assumption that an American audience doesn't really want to see Asian actors?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's a huge part of the problem. And you see that all the time when you talk about predominantly black movies, right? Where they'll assume Hollywood or otherwise, or the public writ large, that like people aren't going to want to go see a movie like Hidden Figures or Fences because the actors and the characters are all black. And then this year's Oscars, I think, proved otherwise, as did the box office with Hidden Figures. Yeah. So, and I think I think, Stephen, what you're trying to say, there's a difference between whitewashing and cultural appropriation or appropriating from a storyline. I don't necessarily disagree, but I think often they go intermingled, and they tend to coexist more often than not. And if you can Kal Penn a while back, who's a very famous American actor of Indian origin, tweeted out a bunch of scripts in his early days about what he was getting, and it was like terrorist, convenience store owner, snake charmer, cab driver, like all the most stereotypical crap that you could think of that you would want to cast an Indian guy in. And I think that's a huge problem that Hollywood has, whether on the TV screen or on the movie screen.
Well, have you seen the white characters in Bollywood movies? I mean, they're all terrible stereotypes. They're all like British officers twirling in that great cricket movie from 5 years ago.
And it's not like white people in India never did anything bad to them, so they would have no reason to do that.
My point is, like, it's not really
surprising.
It's not. The question is one of power. That is exactly the place to look at it. And the simple truth is that Japanese culture industry is in absolutely no danger from Hollywood. They have taken and given back. They are absolutely on par. I mean, the GDP of Tokyo alone is at 5 times Canada's. So the idea that there is some kind of like power imbalance between Japan
something
and
that's
Hollywood
uniquely
is
Japanese,
just simply
right?
hilarious.
Like, that's what it is to me. It's like producing something that's uniquely Japanese and then trying to say, let's just reset it in Seattle.
Who are we to define what's uniquely Japanese?
I think the Japanese people are. Like, I'm not doing that, right? Like, I'm reading the cultural criticism that's coming out, and I'm respecting what these people are saying. When they're saying, like, this is a story that's set in Japan, it's for very important reasons that it's set in Japan. And if this story was borrowed for the truly universal, themes that the makers claim it was for, then it would have been just as easy to cast a Japanese American actor. It's not like there was a shortage of those.
We are talking about the suits in Tokyo and Hollywood. They don't care they care about money.
But
That's
Stephen,
the
there's
point.
been a real backlash here, right? Like there's a lot of people who find this insulting. So you don't think
Well,
that...
I think there has to be some kind of distinction. Because I think there is a real problem with whitewashing. The fact that there's never been an Asian American leading man, for instance, in North America. I mean, that's absurd, right? And that is actually a problem. And there are ways of doing this. But like, if you're going to throw out the exchange of narrative that globalization has brought with it, that is the greatest thing we could lose.
I don't think either of us would want to take it to that line. I just think there's
So
a way of
who's
doing it.
suffering here
We're talking
then?
about a Japanese
Supriya
film.
and Elamine, who's suffering here? Like, who does this hurt?
I think I don't think it necessarily hurts people, but I think it's one of those things that if you don't see yourself represented on screen or represented in popular culture, eventually it erodes away at you because you don't see yourself in the society that you're living in. I mean, that's how I think I would
So this would
characterize
hurt
it.
Japanese Americans?
I mean, particularly people who like have come from the origin points of these stories and then see these stories reappropriated
Like, look,
to faces that don't look like them.
If there was a Ramayana remake in Hollywood and they casted all white actors, I would be a little bit like, what? Why don't you get any Indian people to be in that Bhagavad Gita Ramayana story? Like, it's just one of these things where it's weird. It's like you're going out of your way to almost be offensive and to sort of invite this sort of criticism in a way.
Last word to you, Stephen.
Well, I mean, I think multiculturalism creates like this natural tension. But the question is to actually navigate this so that we keep cultural exchange and don't pathologize it. Because it's actually one of the most beautiful things about living in a multicultural era, in a multicultural space, is that you get access to different people's stories told differently. And if we lose that because of some kind of like siloing off how we're all supposed to be in our own little cultures, that's a terrible loss.
Well, you're seeing different silos. That's the issue.
Right.
You're not seeing people reflected, and you want everything reflected, and I guess that's where the conflict is.